The 2020 coronavirus pandemic was the most cataclysmic sociological event of the past 150 years, more so than 2 world wars or the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. In all likelihood, it has set the world of work on course for some of the biggest changes it has experienced, even during this time of change in almost everything everywhere. By early 2022, the virus had killed 375 million people across the globe, according to the World Health Organization. That's an altogether different level of magnitude than the 80 million killed worldwide in the 2 world wars, or the 50 million estimated to have been killed by the 1918 pandemic. Meanwhile, long COVID continues to cause fogged brains and reduce the available workforce across the globe. The long-term effects on mental health may be significant also, as we outlined in our recent study on Generation Z. It should be no surprise then that the pandemic has changed and continues to change many of the ways of living and working, so extensively and very likely permanently as well. One of the biggest changes has been in the way we work. As the world locked itself indoors during 2020, a new acronym entered our daily conversations as WFH, working from home, became the norm of hundreds of millions among office workers. While many employees welcomed the greater flexibility in their working hours, their employers suspected a lot of them were goofing off while the boss wasn't looking. Quite apart from being more than a little mean-spirited, that concern proved completely wrong. The hours worked actually rose sharply almost everywhere apart from the USA. That's the pink line on the chart. Even here, the hours increased, if only a little bit. That conclusion ignores the long-term context, however, and the increase didn't bring the total hours back to what they were in the 1970s. In the sample, Spain, supposedly the laid-back home of the siesta and mañana attitude to work, was the only country to return to those levels, the yellow line. Even the reputedly hard-working Japanese, dark blue line, and Germans, gray line, didn't quite achieve that. Indeed, the whole concept of 9 to 5 also needs to be given proper context. It's a relatively modern practice, with its official nationwide beginning in the USA, enshrined in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. That established the 40-hour working week, as well as the national minimum wage. Long before that, however, Henry Ford was one of the first big private sector employers to adopt an 8-hour workday. That was in 1914, and it proved to be a roaring success in terms of both productivity and profits. Not surprisingly, many other employers noticed and quickly followed his example. The public sector began the practice even earlier. In 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant issued a proclamation that stipulated an 8-hour day, with no reduction in pay for all government workers. Apart from a happier and more productive workforce making more money and more money for their employers, the thinking behind the choice of 8 hours was that the 24-hour day should be divided into 3 periods of equal length for work, leisure, and sleep. The 1938 Act didn't actually specify an 8-hour working day, however. That followed logically at a time when the 2-day weekend was becoming standard practice. In part, that came about as Christians, then Jews, increasingly pressed their right to exemptions from work on Sundays and Saturdays, their respective holy days. Left with 5 working days, what fitted best was an 8-hour shift, with a 9 a.m. start and 5 p.m. finish. It suited the way most office staff lived, worked, and rested. But how widely was the 9 to 5 timetable followed by American workers in practice? A search for reliable data to answer this proved futile. Very likely that's because even among office workers, the hours worked are highly variable and always have been. Some start and finish work at other times. Many are shift workers. Henry Ford's automobile assembly line workers, for example. About 10% are self-employed, and many more are part-timers. That last statistic is especially significant. Part-timers, defined as those working fewer than 35 hours a week, are a substantial section of the US workforce, although the proportion is now at a bit over 17%, well below the peak seen in 2010. It's likely that this recent discovery in part-time work reflects, to some degree at least, a trend that's emerged since the pandemic. It's become known as quiet quitting. It's not actually about workers quitting their jobs, it's more like work to rule, where employees do no more than the absolute minimum that their contract requires. That means no arriving early at work, no more leaving late, no more attendance at non-mandatory meetings, no more taking less than their full annual vacation, and so forth. The trend exemplifies a change in the attitude to formal work that's been gaining around with millennials and Generation Z. They were among those most affected, mentally, physically, and financially, by the pandemic lockdowns. You could argue that they want to reassert the priority of the life part of the work-life balance, or just as likely, to take back some control over the work element. This is not laziness. In fact, quite the opposite. As we saw earlier, the hours worked by Americans have increased since 2020 by quite a lot. Not only that, but millennials and Gen Z often work more than 2 jobs. They may quiet quit the main breadwinning role, continuing to take its regular paycheck but freeing up more time in order to put hours, heart, and soul into at least one side hustle. Very often, those additional jobs pay no salary. Those who take them eat only what they kill, metaphorically speaking, of course. This table answers the question, how many people have second or third or fourth jobs? It shows how the answers break down across the generations. It shows also that the USA is a clear trendsetter, with almost 40% of the entire population having at least one other source of income. This generational breakdown throws up another potential significant marker. It reveals that America's 2 youngest working generations, millennials and Zoomers, Generation Z that is, born between 1996 and 2010, are by some margin the side hustle champions of the world. In our video about Generation Z, we noted that they are the world's biggest ever generation. In the USA, they represent more than a quarter of the population and about the same across the world as a whole. Also, they share many of the same attitudes and concerns as millennials, the generation born between 1981 and 1996. In this country, millennials are the biggest ever generation, even bigger than Zoomers. These were among the findings of a survey conducted in May 2021 by Adobe, a leading American software firm. Think about it. These 2 groups, nearly 142 million Americans, already constitute more than 42% of our entire population, and the eldest of them are only just into their 40s. How will that affect working future habits? We can't really be sure of the answer, of course, but many of the preferences and needs of the 2 groups are already in plain view. Let's take a look. Those preferences and needs have been forged largely by these 2 generations' shared experience of the Great Financial Crisis, 2007 to 2009, the pandemic, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2022. The last of those 2 upheavals saw the US rate of inflation awaken sharply from a period of decline or relative stagnation that had persisted for some 40 years. It's not surprising, therefore, that the cost of living tops millennials and Zoomer concerns. It suggests that the generations will continue to seek extra income sources outside of their main work. In turn, that means they will continue to prioritize flexibility in their working hours. This has been among their main wishes for a few years already, as the 2021 Adobe survey demonstrated. The same survey also revealed that the average working week across the developed world is now around 45 hours. Already, therefore, the writing could be on the wall for the old 9-to-5 regimen. Flexibility is a two-way street, however. It's all very well that millennials and Zoomers want more flexibility, but that won't happen unless their employers agree to it. What do they think? They too have learned many new lessons from the pandemic and the revival of inflation. First off, the lockdowns of 2020. While temporarily damaging to manufacturers and product-making industries generally, were a gift to many of the service industries. That's especially true of software developers, vendors, or other businesses whose markets are online or in the cloud. That's why American firms such as Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google saw record profits in 2020. Those 5 corporations, known collectively as the FANGs, led the US stock markets to a new all-time high at the end of that year. That was a pretty obvious outcome of a nation using those companies' software or online facilities in order to work from home. Less obvious was the upturn in worker productivity that we noticed earlier. That was an unexpected benefit for pretty much every kind of enterprise. It also means that employers realized firsthand that delivering what workers wanted was good for business. That this benefit was so widespread arose from 2 long-term developments across all of American businesses. The most fundamental of those long-term developments was the transformation of the US economy from manufacturing to services, especially since the end of World War II in 1945. In turn, that encouraged the second major development, women joining the US workforce. Up to the 1940s, it was rare for both a husband and wife to be working. Since then, it's become commonplace. Those working wives have had to juggle the demands of a job, even a part-time one, with managing a home, childcare, cooking, shopping for groceries, and so on. They needed flexible hours much more than the men did. The services industry had to listen, therefore, or go out of business. In any case, the 8-hour day is never really just 8 hours. You may have a lengthy commute to and from your place of work, while work-related emails, texts, and phone calls can, in some jobs, start before breakfast and continue well into the evening. And by the way, if you think those intrusions on home life tipped the work-life balance in entirely the wrong direction, spare a thought for new recruits at the big Wall Street firms. Here's a key page from the now notorious Goldman Sachs survey of its newcomers in February 2021. Mind you, a junior analyst at Goldman gets a salary of at least $51,000 before any bonuses. That might draw the string of not actually having a life, at least a little bit. What then is the future of 9 to 5? We've learned already that it's a schedule that was never that widespread in the first place. It's taken further hits from some pretty significant and substantial long-term changes in working practices that we've noted, especially a gender revolution in the composition of American workforce, as well as a complete sea change in the nature of American industry. Has the pandemic and its long-tail effects on more than 140 million of our top-producing new generations of workers sounded its death knell at last? The evidence is pretty clear. In order to continue the improvements in productivity, prosperity, and above all, in personal job satisfaction that have emerged over the past 75 years or so, it is essential that our working men and women are given the freedom to participate that they want in the way that they want it. At a time where employers are finding it hard to fill vacancies, American job seekers hold all of the aces. They want to work, but they need flexibility, and they hate being told what to do. So long then, 9 to 5. It really hasn't been that good to know you.